Good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me? Wonderful. I'm Tracy Glab, Executive Director of the Flint Institute of Arts, Museum and Art School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Sheppy Dog Fun Lecture. Tonight, we have Dr. Janine Yoromoto-Bolt presenting Paradise in the Parlor at Home with the Fowler Family. The Sheppy Dog Fun Lecture Series was established in 2012 by Dr. Alan Klein to address the topics of art, religion, and history. Thank you, Dr. Klein, for continuing to bring these wonderful lectures to the FIA. I would also like to thank and acknowledge the Piper family who are here tonight, especially Bill, who were so captivated by the mystery of the Fowler family portrait. They provided funds for our Director of Donor Relations, Catherine Sharbaugh, at the left there, and the Curator of Collections and Exhibitions, Sarah Cohn, on the right, and me to take a research trip to Clayton, New York, where the Fowler family was from originally, in October 2022. And this photo of Catherine and Sarah is in front of the Fowler family tombstone. We actively searched the cemetery for a tombstone that might reveal something about the mystery of Gertrude, but we did not find anything. The Piper family have also generously contributed to further research done on this work, so thank you so much. I am also fascinated by this portrait, so I'm looking forward to tonight. And the next Sheppy Dog Fun Lecture will be on July 18th with Dr. Noah Charney, delivering 2 different lectures. So he's flying in all the way from Slovenia, so we said, why not get the most of him while he's here? The first lecture is The Thefts of the Mona Lisa at 2 p.m. The second lecture is Brushed Aside, the Untold Story of Women in Art, and that's at 6 p.m. We're offering a lunch before the 2 o'clock lecture. It's a $13 charge, so if you're interested in attending, sign up online, or you can also call our front desk. Following each lecture, there will be a Q&A and book signing. So both of these lectures are based on books he's recently published. So you really can't miss him. He's quite a great speaker. We're excited for him to come. Before I introduce our guest tonight, I would like to thank the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation for their continued support, which is so deeply appreciated and vital to the FIA. I would also like to thank the citizens of Genesee County for demonstrating their support of the FIA by means of the Genesee County Arts, Education, and Cultural Enrichment Millage, which provides free entry to the FIA for Genesee County citizens 7 days a week. And a big thank you to Huntington Bank and Greg Viner, who's here tonight, for sponsoring Huntington Free Saturdays, which allows everyone, regardless of where you live, beyond our county and then some, to have free entry on Saturdays. So thank you, Huntington Bank. And thank you to the Ford Foundation Equity Fund of the Community Foundation of Greater Flint for making the ASL interpretation possible tonight. Please take a moment to silence your electronic devices. Dr. Janine Yoromoto-Bolt is the Collection Reinstallation Project Associate at the Chazen Museum of Art at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she is involved in planning comprehensive reinstallation of the permanent collection galleries. Previously, she was the Associate Curator of American Art at the Chazen and a Mellon Foundational Postdoctoral Curatorial Fellow at the American Philosophical Society. She holds a PhD in American Studies from William and Mary and specializes in early American visual culture. Recent curatorial projects include Remancipation, Resource and Ruin, Wisconsin's Enduring Landscape, and Dr. Franklin, Citizen Scientist. Her scholarship on colonial art and portraiture has been published by Winterthur Portfolio, American Art, Panorama, and the Dar Museum. She is the researcher behind Colonial Virginia Portraits, a digital project produced in collaboration with the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture. Everyone, please join me in a warm Flint welcome for Dr. Janine Yoromoto Bolt. Thank you so much. We're looking forward to this tonight.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank all of you for coming out tonight to learn more about this portrait in the collection here. And I just want to give a special thank you to Emily Legleitner, Catherine Shawbaugh, and I'm sorry, Craig, I didn't get your last name, but he's handling all the tech for me. I just want to thank you for your help in getting here and for the warm welcome to Flint. All right, so first on loan in the 1960s, and then in the permanent collection of the Flint Institute of Arts since 1975, this charming portrait of the Fowler children has captured the attention of many visitors because of the lush landscape and the striking iconography behind these children. Initially, many assumed the landscape in the distance was a representation of the Thousand Islands region, the area of New York where this painting was reportedly completed. However, there are no mountains in that region of New York, and there are very clearly in the painting. More recently, in recognition that the landscape in the distance is in fact imaginary, scholars have posited that it might be a post-mortem portrait because of some of the symbols, right? So perhaps one of these children had passed away. The Edenic landscape in the distance, which could represent heaven, the white dress of the little girl on the right, which could indicate that she was deceased, the rosebuds and falling roses on the right, which were symbols of the futility of life or life cut short, the coral necklace she wears, another symbol sometimes associated with death, and the apparent separation of the two children on the left wearing dark clothing from the young girl on the right who wears white. These two children sit in front of a trellis while the younger girl sits in front of the heavenly landscape in the background. So could the little girl on the right actually have been deceased when the portrait was painted? What we do know of the portrait is that it represents the three youngest children of John Nash Fowler and his first wife, Delia Scott Fowler, Delia, Milo, and Gertrude. It was donated to the museum by the granddaughter of Delia, the older daughter pictured on the left. So the granddaughter who donated the portrait was named Adelaide Schnuck. Her mother was Gertrude Tucker, who inherited the portrait from her mother, Delia Fowler. And here's an abbreviated family tree so you have a sense of the relationships between all of these individuals. Understanding the provenance or history of this portrait is important because it speaks to the accuracy of the identification of the portrait's subjects. Adelaide Schnuck identified the three sitters as Delia, Milo, and Gertrude when it first came to Flint only about 100 years after it had been painted. The subject was her grandmother, and she was therefore only 2 generations removed from the individuals, making it likely that her identification of the sitters was in fact accurate. And she probably grew up in a house with the portrait and heard the identification of the sitters most of her life. And if you can see the life dates, she likely knew her grandmother, right, before she had passed away. And often if, descendants wrongly identify an ancestor in a portrait, it's because, the long time has passed. But according to Adelaide Schnuck, it was painted in 1854 by an itinerant or traveling painter from Philadelphia. And she recorded that John Nash Fowler, the father, paid the unknown artist $300, and the artist lived with the Fowlers while completing the composition. So, could the little girl identified as Gertrude have been deceased when it was painted? Maybe the little girl is not Gertrude at all. In the antebellum period, post-mortem portraits were actually relatively common, particularly for children. Families who wanted to preserve an image of a recently deceased child could commission an artist to paint a portrait either very soon after their death or based on a photograph. And as you can imagine, this sentimental practice allowed the grieving parents to memorialize their beloved children. This group portrait of the Alling children was commissioned after the death of the only son, seen here on the far left. The deceased child is physically separated from his 3 living sisters. He's also on a differently patterned carpet and placed in a separate spotlight. As I mentioned earlier, there is a sort of similar separation in the Fowler portrait. But this separation is not enough to confirm post-mortem imagery alone. You can also note that the deceased boy in the Alling portraits is actually the one wearing darker clothes, illustrating the problem of using color to identify a deceased child, as no color can confidently be associated with death. Here's another documented post-mortem portrait that shows a deceased girl wearing a red dress. She's doing a craft and sitting with educational paper materials, not unlike the book that Gertrude Fowler holds. And this post-mortem portrait includes a representation of a grave marker, right? So the young boy is standing in front of a view of a boat on the water, and water and boats make regular appearances in post-mortem portraits because of their association with the idea of passing and the relationship between water and Christian rituals, especially baptism. He plucks an unopened rose from the flower arrangement, which also includes forget-me-nots and other flowers associated with innocence and mourning. And you can see from these examples how the Fowler children portrait does in fact share some similarities with these documented contemporary post-mortem portraits. However, most post-mortem portraits can actually only be firmly identified as post-mortem imagery when there are associated records of the deceased or the inclusion of gravestones, as in this image of Nicholas Catlin on the left. Right? Many of the symbols in mourning portraits can also be found in portraits of children that are not mourning portraits at all. And unlike the 3 post-mortem images that I just shared, the Fowler family records document that Gertrude was definitely alive when the portrait was painted. As you can see from this family tree, Gertrude, whose full legal name was actually Clarissa Gertrude, did not die until 1907. There was an older daughter named Puella who died as an infant in 1836. However, she passed away at only 8 months old. And while guessing ages from portraits can be very difficult, this child identified as Gertrude is certainly older than that, right? And Puella was also older than Milo, so the relative ages of the children do not correspond to the children in the portrait if this was in fact a deceased image of Puella, right? That doesn't work out. Further, I was able to track down a few photographs of the Fowler family. So here's a photograph identified as Gertrude as a young girl in the middle with her parents. And I'll let you decide for yourself if these girls are one and the same, but I think there's definitely a good resemblance there. And here's another photograph. While the girls are much older in this photo than in the portrait, there does still seem actually to be a physical similarity between the images of the girls identified as Gertrude. So here's a close-up of the photograph and the portrait of Gertrude Fowler. And I can certainly imagine that the little girl on the right grew into the woman pictured on the left. So just for fun, because I found it, here's a photograph of Delia Fowler as an older woman as well. So what did the symbols in this portrait mean if it's not a post-mortem portrait? For the rest of today's presentation, I'm going to share what I have learned about the Fowler family and how this portrait can be understood in the context of middle-class 19th century American culture, and in particular, in the context of an evangelical Christian home and family. We can learn some things about the Fowler family from public records, such as the census, John Nash Fowler's will, and local histories. Some information comes from a family history prepared by the donor of the painting, Adelaide Schnuck. But more information about the family's personal life can be hard to come by. Luckily, we get some insight from the personal papers of Nettie Fowler McCormick. Nettie Fowler was the cousin of the 3 children in the portrait, and the niece of John Nash Fowler. Nettie Fowler's papers are preserved at the Wisconsin Historical Society because she married Cyrus McCormick, an inventor who founded the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company, which produced the McCormick Reaper. They became one of the wealthiest couples in the nation. Nettie became a philanthropist, believing that she had a responsibility to use her money for good as a good Christian, and these Christian values will come back in this presentation. She was orphaned as a child, so she was raised by her grandmother and other extended family. And while John Nash Fowler was not her legal guardian, the family was very close, and so a few letters and photographs from the Fowler family exist in her personal papers. And you can see on the screen here a letter from John Nash Fowler to Nettie, as well as a photograph, including Caroline Fowler, older sister of the 3 children from the portrait. And Nettie's papers provide some insight into the extended Fowler family. John Nash Fowler was married to Delia Scott Fowler. In 2020, the descendants of Fowler's eldest daughter, Caroline, donated portraits of the two to the Flint Institute of Arts to reunite the family portraits. And these are dated to roughly 1840. In regards to the unknown artist of these two portraits, I think he was pretty talented as well. Right, so just, again, for fun, photographs of the two parents. The photograph of Delia is likely dated to the 1860s, so quite a bit later than the painted portrait, but I still think the artist did a pretty good job capturing their likenesses. Okay, so anyway, John and Delia then had 5 children. The eldest was Caroline, not in the painting, then the daughter Puella, who was born and died in 1836, then Delia in 1838, Milo in 1839, and Gertrude several years later in 1846. And we know the family was comfortably middle to middle upper class because they employed a maid in their home, as evidenced by census records. In the 1850s, when the Fowler children were painted, John Nash Fowler was a very successful merchant and shipbuilder who lived with his family in Clayton, New York, marked on this contemporary map by the red star. Fowler was a partner in the shipping company, Merrick, Fowler, and Esselstyn, and they did business in the Great Lakes region, regularly sending ships filled with lumber, coal, and grain from New York State to Chicago and cities along the way. Western cities, including Chicago, Cleveland, and Detroit, were rapidly expanding, leading to business for firms like Fowler's who sent desperately needed supplies. Eldridge Merrick, John Nash Fowler, and Henry Esselstyn were an important business for Clayton, and they employed a large number of residents as builders and sailors. One historian noted that the firm had a fleet of 14 barks, schooners, and brigs called the, quote, reindeer fleet. And he recorded that the emblem was a reindeer on a dark background indicating speed, and this conspicuous banner was carried proudly into all ports of the Great Lakes. And on this lithograph of one of their ships, you can actually see the reindeer banner. So local histories of Clayton remember them as one of, if not the, most important firm in Clayton from roughly the 1830s through the 1850s. And so as a result, the partners, including Fowler, were very active civic leaders. John Nash Fowler was related to both of his partners through shared descent or marriage, and all three were also involved with the establishment of Clayton's Methodist Episcopal Church, photographs of which you see here. John Nash Fowler served as a trustee there and was remembered in local histories as, quote, a faithful and substantial member of that church. He was also remembered as a man of great energy and wonderful endurance, a strict church member, a public-spirited citizen, an honorable man, and one highly exact in his requirements of others while holding himself bound by the same rule of conduct. And although I was unable to track where Milo Fowler, the son, went to school, I know that Eldridge Fowler, who was Nettie Fowler's brother and Milo's cousin, went to Cazenovia College. The girls, Carolyn and Delia Fowler, attended Fowler Seminary, and both of these schools were associated with Methodism. In 1856, John Nash Fowler moved his family to Detroit along with his partner Eldridge Merrick. They all show up for the first time in the 1857 to 58 Detroit City Directory, and the family joined the congregation of the Central United Methodist Church there. According to records, John Nash Fowler sold a plot of land to the congregation for the building of a new church, which occurred around 1863 after the former church burned down. We also know that Fowler operated a sawmill and owned some land in Fowler, Michigan, in Clinton County, and he gave land there to the local congregation of the Methodist Episcopal Church as well. And apparently, the town of Fowler in Clinton County, not to be confused with Fowlerville, was named after John Nash Fowler. So all of this establishes that the Fowler family were in fact practicing Methodists. In fact, John Nash Fowler's Methodist faith is mentioned in nearly every local or regional history of Clayton that even mentions the Fowler name. Understanding their faith and what it meant to be a Methodist in the 1850s helps us understand the significance of the Fowler children painting. So Methodism was the fastest growing religious denomination in the United States in the early 19th century. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, Methodist preachers traveled on horseback along circuits, visiting communities or conferences. They did not originally have congregational churches. They were sort of an unestablished or disestablished church. They spoke to very large camps and open fields. Methodists were known for very emotional responses to feeling the Holy Spirit, which is what this particular print is referring to. It was an evangelical Christian denomination, and devotees believed that all people had the ability to be saved and reach heaven by the grace of God if they were willing to accept the gospel and acknowledge that they were sinners. Compared to some other denominations, the Methodists were remarkably egalitarian, and Northern Methodists, like the Fowlers, tended to be abolitionists. In fact, the split between the Northern and Southern Methodists due to slavery in the late 1850s was noted by contemporary observers as a precursor to what would become the national split of the Civil War. And that is how culturally and politically powerful the faith was. By the 1850s, however, Methodism on the East Coast had become more traditionally organized. Congregational churches were established in many communities, such as Clayton, where the Fowler family were actually really key founding members. And there were also more preachers available, meaning that preachers did not have to travel on circuits. They could actually settle in their own communities. And the exception to this was, of course, in the West and recently settled areas where people lived much further apart. Which actually does bring us back to the portrait of the Fowler children. So we know that they were devout Methodists and were upper middle class. And in the 1850s, the home was viewed as the place where morality, piety, and patriotism were encouraged. Maintaining a proper home was believed to cultivate good Christian citizens. Decorating a home well with tasteful art and furniture would aid in this spiritual growth. And the decor also showed the outside world who might walk by or visit the home the family's character. The home was also arguably the most important religious space in their lives. While families attended church services once a week, it was in the home where parents really were the ones teaching about religion, morality, and proper behavior daily, much like now. It was the site of regular prayer and the study of the Bible, as this lithograph depicting a young couple reading scripture together in a parlor illustrates. The family Bible was commonly displayed in the parlor, providing a focal point for family devotions, as well as showing off the family's faith to visitors. And we know the Fowlers had a family Bible because there are records on Ancestry.com from it. Decorations in the home, especially the parlor, were intended to contribute to the moral formation of children. The parlor was the most public space in the house. It was where visitors to the home were likely to be entertained. And the parlor was also a gathering space for the family. Lithographs by companies such as Currier and Ives and Kellogg and Comstock marketed pictures expressly for the parlor. For example, the hand-colored lithograph on the screen right now is an example of the type of commercial image marketed directly toward middle-class homes like the Fowlers. It represents a Protestant ideal. A family sits around a dining table praying together in the morning. The father leads the family in prayer, and the children listen attentively. There was a belief that children would grow to resemble the things that they contemplated most often, absorbing lessons imparted not just from a religious and moral texts, but also images. Therefore, images that families hung in the parlor had educational purposes. And aside from commercial lithographs, family portraits were commonly found in these parlor spaces. Portraits were traditionally hung in these formal or public rooms of the house so that they were very visible to guests. Family portraits also had very long histories of serving as inspiration for family members, presenting ideal versions of themselves. And this lithograph of a family represents this idea, right? The family sits in front of portraits of the mother and father. And the Fowler children portrait likely was intended to hang in the Fowler family portrait first in Clayton and then later in Detroit. So all of this background about religion and the power of images is leading up to my argument that the Fowler children portrait was intended to display the family's religious values and serve a moral function for the children. The portrait not only presented an idealized version of the three children, it served as a sort of visual model for them as they grew up. For Delia, Milo, and Gertrude, they saw an idealized image of themselves, projections of the type of children and Christians that they were supposed to be. The three Fowler children are represented in modest but fashionable and clean attire. They are in a very well-tended garden space with the vine and trellis and roses in the foreground. And they sit upright, seemingly conveying their good manners and strong moral character. The landscape and elements in the background, which I'll speak more about momentarily, projected the family's Christian beliefs as well. Now, this portrait likely hung alongside or near portraits of their parents, who were additional models for strong moral character. And although I have not tracked down a portrait of Caroline Fowler, it's entirely possible that a portrait of her existed here as well. Caroline was the oldest child, right? And in 1854, she was about 21 years old, no longer a child to be included in this portrait. But she may have been painted separately, either at the same time or when she was younger. So let's get into the details of this portrait and all of the Christian symbolism within. So as I mentioned, the children are wearing clothing appropriate to their ages. Delia, around 16 when the portrait was painted, holds a trimmed bonnet and wears a modest purple dress of silk or satin with black lace trim and structured bodice. Gertrude wears a white dress, probably cotton, with just a little lace trim on the sleeve and a looser waist. Milo wears a black and gray suit with the red kind of tie. A straw hat trimmed in black lies between his legs. And they sit upright, again, with good posture, showing good Christian control over their bodies and emotions. Gertrude sits next to a rose bush, holding one rose in her left hand, more roses over a book in her lap, and even more roses can be seen on the ground all around her. So roses in these different life stages suggest the fleetingness of life and are often found in portraits of youth. The roses are buds or full blooms, suggesting youth in the prime of life. She also wears a coral necklace. Many Americans believe that coral held protective qualities. It was a common jewelry, therefore, for children. Family letters in the Nettie Fowler McCormick correspondence attest to how preoccupied Americans in the 1850s were with illness. Letters to and from Nettie to her relations are filled with concerns about illness and reports of sickness in the family in the 1850s, including Gertrude. Her parents perhaps hoped that coral would help ward off evil and illness, particularly after they suffered the loss of their infant daughter named Puella. The children are also affiliated with common gendered objects. So Milo holds a riding crop, which speaks to his masculinity and mastery over nature. The end of another stick is tucked under his arm, perhaps the end of a walking stick. Meanwhile, his sisters hold a bonnet and flowers, symbols of femininity. As men were expected to master nature, including emotional nature, women were associated with nature. And these objects speak to their expected future roles as Christian husbands and wives, as these complementary roles. The primer or prayer book held in Gertrude's lap is a marker of the family's education. The writing is illegible, but the visible illustration appears to be a house with a person and animal, possibly a reference to the idealized farmstead or home that appeared in illustrated children's books. Methodists, like other evangelical Protestants, promoted Christian education for all children, establishing a number of Sunday schools for both boys and girls. And they also published a number of Sunday school books, which were illustrated gift books for children, filled with spiritual and moralizing stories like the examples seen here. And this particular illustration is sort of reminiscent of the one seen in Gertrude's lap. The books she holds may very well have actually come from the family's library. The trellis and roses suggest that the children sit in a garden, which is a very common setting for group portraits. The Fowler family likely did have at least a small garden. Middle-class Christian families often maintained gardens, as they considered cultivated gardens a very important extension of the home and a place where families could connect with nature, and thus with God, who revealed himself through nature. Which brings us to the landscape in the background. The distant landscape appears unique, but it fits into the genre of idealized Edenic landscapes. You can see some similarities with the Garden of Eden painting painted by the country's premier landscape painter, Thomas Cole. Both landscapes include tall mountains, waterfall, lush trees, peaceful animals, and very small human figures in the landscape. Protestants tended to avoid traditionally Catholic religious images, such as representations of saints or images of the Virgin Mary. However, they did appreciate allegorical landscapes and understood nature as God revealing himself. Images of mankind and nature was a reminder of God's power, especially when humans were rendered very small, which was a very common trope in American landscape painting. In fact, the evangelical Christian appreciation for landscape is one of the reasons that landscape painting was so popular in the 19th century. They saw the expansive American landscape as a sign of God's blessing over the nation. And when I was walking through the galleries earlier today, I was reminded that the Flint Institute of Arts has a Jasper Cropsey painting here that could very well have fit into this presentation as well. It's the same kind of attitude towards nature. Similar types of landscapes also appear in other contemporary family portraits, as in this painting believed to represent the artist's family. The artist titled it Domestic Felicity, again emphasizing the connection between family, home, religion, and nature, as the painting suggests that true happiness is manifested in domestic life when infused with spirituality through this Edenic landscape. And here's another example of two sisters sitting in a landscape that share similar features as the Fowler children, including, again, the mountains and the water in the distance and roses on the right. And these young girls also wear coral necklaces very similar to Gertrude's. On the right of the Fowler children composition, between Gertrude and the roses, is a tall waterfall with a very small man standing on a cliff next to what appears to be a dog. Waterfalls were reminders of God's power and the strength of nature. Dogs were traditional symbols of loyalty. And behind the waterfall is this tall mountain, which in Christian tradition, scaling mountains would bring one closer to God. Towards the center of the composition, to the left of Gertrude, two figures appear to be fishing on a bridge. And fishermen were symbols of the apostles, fishers of men bringing mankind to Christ. And there is a group of what appears to be dark-colored cows or oxen and white sheep in the distance, suggesting abundance and peace in the landscape. Groups of animals peacefully grazing in the landscape were very popular in American landscape paintings as signs of the nation's prosperity and God's blessing over the nation. Both animals also have significance in Christian iconography. Right? Cows and oxen are symbols of sacrifice, and oxen in particular are associated with nativity scenes in St. Luke the Evangelist. Sheep are also symbols of sacrifice and are particularly associated with Jesus Christ, the sacrificial lamb. Now, it is less clear what the two horses represent. One brown horse with his reins visible peeks out from behind a tree at the center of the canvas. And it is possible that this horse corresponds to Milo and the riding crop that he holds, right? Perhaps this horse is a reminder of the nature that Milo will master. Horses also have historic iconography, historic iconographic precedent as accompanying riders on a journey. So this horse could be waiting for the children to accompany them into paradise, which is their heavenly reward if they are upright, moral Christians. The black horse and rider galloping in the distance along the trail may also be a reference to heavenly rewards. However, it's also possible that this horse is a reference to the circuit riders, the Methodist preachers who traveled on horseback visiting their congregations. Those circuit riders had mostly disappeared by the 1850s on the East Coast. They were an iconic feature of Methodism. Overall, the portrait's landscape is a presentation of the Edenic paradise that awaits the children if they are offered salvation by God. As evangelical Christians, Methodists believe that all people could be saved if they recognized their roles as sinners and were open to God's saving grace. The religious overtones of the landscape also suggest that God has blessed the family with peace and prosperity. And since John Nash Fowler was a highly successful businessman, this interpretation also makes sense. So perhaps we may wonder what became of these children. Did they grow into the upstanding Christian citizens that their parents hoped they would? Gertrude married a man named Henry Fowler and eventually moved to the Chicago area. They struggled financially, but they maintained a positive relationship with their Fowler relations. Delia Fowler married Sidney Tucker and also seems to have struggled financially for a time. They took in boarders to pay their bills, and they relocated to Flint. The inheritance the girls received from John Nash Fowler does not seem to have lasted very long or helped them very much, partially because of an economic depression in the late 19th century. However, they became wives and mothers and seemed to have lived generally good lives and were well remembered by descendants who corresponded with Nettie Fowler McCormick's family. Milo, on the other hand, is a different, very intriguing story. I could not learn very much about Milo in the archives. However, there's a very interesting letter dated to 1858, so only about 4 years after his portrait was painted. And this letter is from his cousin, Eldridge Fowler, who wrote to his sister, Nettie Fowler. Eldridge wrote that Milo was getting into a lot of trouble and keeping some very bad company. Eldridge had warned his uncle, John Nash Fowler, to discipline Milo previously, right, suggesting that this is not a new problem for Milo. By August 1858, apparently John Nash Fowler was thinking of enlisting Milo in the Navy to send him to sea for at least 3 to 4 years. And so Eldridge was writing to Nettie to see if she had any naval contacts to help with this process. This didn't actually happen, as there are no military records for Milo until he registered for the Civil War draft. So I did not find further discussion of Milo after this. Notably, though, he did not become a partner in his father's business. John Nash Fowler also explicitly stated in his will, which I've highlighted here, that Milo should have no control over his estate and did not name him as an executor, choosing his sons-in-law and business partners instead. He did, however, intend to leave him land and an income as long as he lived with his wife. So, Milo married a woman named Maria Nill. The two had no children, and Milo died in 1872, so actually about 7 years before his father. Curiously, however, Milo's death was not recorded in the family Bible, supposedly inherited by Delia Fowler Tucker, that's available on Ancestry.com. He was included in the family cemetery plot. He also appears in this photograph as a family descendant identified the man as Uncle Milo. Clearly, he remained involved with his family, though perhaps no one trusted him with money or business decisions. So although details of Milo's life are unclear, and again, I couldn't find records of his schooling either, right? I'm sure that there is some very interesting family drama here. So perhaps I've digressed too far from the portrait. However, family portraits are treasured objects, right, that have historically were created to preserve family members' likenesses and to act as moral guides. They continue to be treasured for these very reasons, but also for the stories that they can help tell as mnemonic devices. And I would love to have been a fly on the wall, right? If you were Adelaide Schnuck as a little girl, what did she hear about her Uncle Milo, right? Milo's story is part of the portrait's history and a reminder that portraits and images can never fully capture complicated family dynamics, and that portraits are always more idealistic than realistic. And so with that, I will end my formal presentation, but I am very happy to answer some questions. So thank you very much for listening.